In the early records of European contact with Rapa Nui, Easter Island appears in fragmented accounts shaped by brief landings, uncertain conditions, and limited understanding of a remote volcanic landscape in the South Pacific. From Jacob Roggeveen's arrival in 1722 through later Spanish, British and French expeditions, crews recorded shifting impressions of rugged coastlines, scattered settlements, and the massive stone figures standing along the island's interior slopes. These observations were never unified into a single account, but instead formed a pattern of incomplete and often inconsistent descriptions, shaped by distance, time, and restricted interaction with the island's inhabitants. As you move through these recorded encounters, you will follow what European crews actually observed from ship decks and shorelines, where every approach carried uncertainty and every landing revealed only partial visibility of life on the island. You will see how different expeditions interpreted the coastline, the settlements, and the presence of the moai, and how limited contact shaped what could be confirmed and what remained uncertain in their reports. The shore where the first Europeans were shot at, far out in the southeastern Pacific beyond the shipping routes normally followed by European vessels in the early 18th century, there existed an island that appeared so isolated that many sailors believed no permanent population could survive there for long. The ocean surrounding it stretched for thousands of miles without interruption, and the volcanic landmass itself rose abruptly from the water with dark cliffs, bare hills, and strange silhouettes standing against the horizon. When Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen first approached the island on April 5, 1722, his crew could not have known that the place would soon become associated with one of the most unsettling encounters of their entire voyage. Before the ships anchored offshore, the men were already staring at shapes along the coastline that did not resemble anything previously recorded in European exploration journals, and the silence surrounding those figures only deepened the unease spreading through the decks of the fleet. Roggeveen had departed from the Dutch Republic in 1721 under orders connected to the search for Terra Australis, the hypothetical southern continent many Europeans still believed existed somewhere in the Pacific. His expedition consisted primarily of 3 ships, the Arend, the Tienhoven, and the Afrikaanse Galie. Months at sea had exhausted the crews long before the island appeared in the distance, and conditions aboard the vessels had deteriorated through disease, harsh weather, and the relentless monotony of open ocean travel. For sailors who had spent weeks surrounded only by water and cloud, the sudden appearance of inhabited land should have offered relief. Instead, the island produced confusion almost immediately, because the coastline appeared sparsely populated, treeless in many areas, and dominated by enormous stone figures positioned inland as though they were watching the sea itself. European crews during this period were accustomed to seeing ceremonial structures in distant territories, but the scale and number of the moai deeply disturbed many observers. Roggeveen's men described immense carved statues standing upright upon stone platforms, some of them facing inland while others appeared visible from the coast. Later measurements would show that many of these figures weighed dozens of tons, yet in 1722 the Europeans had no understanding of how the islanders had transported them across volcanic terrain with limited wood resources. The statues appeared ancient even then, and the inability to explain them created a lingering sense that the island belonged to a civilization whose history had already become partially lost before Europeans ever arrived. Some sailors reportedly believed the figures resembled guardians positioned around the island rather than monuments created by ordinary human labour. The Dutch named the island Pasch Island, or Easter Island, because Roggeveen arrived there on Easter Sunday, but the people already living on the island knew it as Rapa Nui. Early observations suggested that islanders approached the European ships with caution rather than immediate hostility. Canoes moved across the water carrying individuals curious about the unfamiliar vessels anchored offshore, and accounts from the expedition described people swimming toward the ships while attempting to communicate through gestures. Yet beneath these exchanges there remained a dangerous uncertainty shared by both sides. Neither group understood the intentions of the other, and neither possessed a common language capable of reducing suspicion before panic took hold. Several accounts from the expedition indicate that islanders gathered in increasing numbers near the landing area as Dutch sailors prepared to go ashore. For the Europeans, armed landings were standard procedure during long voyages because crews feared ambushes, theft, or sudden attacks in unfamiliar territories. Muskets and pistols, therefore, accompanied landing parties even during supposedly peaceful encounters. To the islanders observing from the shoreline, however, the armed strangers emerging from enormous wooden ships likely appeared just as threatening as the islanders themselves seemed to the Europeans. Historians continue debating the exact sequence of events that followed, partly because surviving reports contain contradictions, but multiple versions agree that tension escalated rapidly once the Dutch attempted to establish a stronger presence on land. One account suggests that crowds moved too closely around the Europeans, creating fear among the armed sailors who believed they were being surrounded. Another version claims that islanders may have touched or attempted to seize European clothing and equipment, behaviour commonly misunderstood by explorers during first contact encounters across the Pacific. Whatever triggered the panic, the atmosphere along the shore changed within moments, from wary curiosity into violence. Dutch muskets were raised toward the crowd, and gunfire erupted across the landing area with devastating effect. The sound alone would have transformed the scene into terror. 18th century muskets produced thick smoke, deafening explosions and catastrophic wounds at close range. For many islanders present that day, the weapons must have seemed incomprehensible because no technology on the island resembled firearms. Roggeveen later wrote that several islanders were killed during the confrontation, though exact numbers remain uncertain. Some later retellings claim the deaths were higher, but historians generally treat those figures cautiously. What remains undeniable is that the shoreline became the site of sudden bloodshed within hours of Europe's first confirmed landing on Easter Island. For the sailors themselves, the violence reinforced fears already growing aboard the expedition. European crews often interpreted resistance or confusion during first contact as evidence of danger lurking beneath unfamiliar customs, and the isolation of Easter Island intensified those suspicions. The island stood thousands of miles from continental land masses, populated by people whose origins Europeans could not explain, and surrounded by monuments whose construction seemed impossible, according to European assumptions about isolated societies. After the gunfire, every movement along the shoreline likely carried a new layer of fear, because the sailors no longer viewed the island merely as mysterious. They are now associated with sudden death. Descriptions recorded during the visit also reveal the strange contrast that continued haunting the Europeans even after the shooting. Despite the violence, islanders still approached the expedition in certain situations afterward, suggesting that communication attempts did not entirely collapse. Roggeveen's crew observed body paint, tattoos, agricultural plots, and carefully constructed stone structures that indicated an organised society, rather than a primitive outpost barely surviving in isolation. Yet the Europeans struggled to reconcile those observations with the apparent scarcity of resources on the island. Trees large enough for major construction projects seemed absent, and the barren appearance of portions of the landscape raised immediate questions about how such a remote population had sustained itself, while also carving and transporting gigantic statues. That uncertainty became part of the island's horror in European imagination. Sailors returned to their ships carrying conflicting impressions that resisted simple explanation. The island appeared inhabited yet strangely diminished. The statues suggested power and coordination on a scale that no longer matched the visible condition of the society encountered in 1722. Even during this first recorded European contact, there were hints that the island had already experienced severe upheaval long before outsiders arrived. Some statues reportedly stood upright, while others appeared damaged or neglected, and the overall atmosphere described by later visitors increasingly resembled the remnants of something that had once been larger and more stable. For exhausted crews already weakened by disease, isolation, and months of dangerous navigation, Easter Island became more than a geographical discovery. It became a place associated with confusion, violence, and unanswered questions that lingered long after the ships disappeared beyond the horizon. The gunfire on the shore marked the beginning of a long and destructive relationship between the island and outside powers. But for the Europeans who witnessed those first moments of chaos, the horror emerged from something deeper than combat alone. They had arrived expecting another island in the Pacific and instead encountered a landscape filled with silent stone faces, frightened crowds, and the unsettling sense that they had stepped into the remains of a world whose history nobody aboard their ships could understand. The statues remained motionless as the smoke drifted across the shoreline, the island covered in giant watching faces. Long before any anchor touched the seabed near Easter Island, dark shapes had already begun appearing along the ridges beyond the surf. from the decks of the Dutch ships commanded by Jacob Roggeveen in April of 1722, the island did not first reveal itself through villages, fires, or movement along the shore, but through towering forms standing motionless above the coastline. The southeastern Pacific was vast enough to make any sudden landfall feel unreal after months at sea. Yet what emerged from the horizon that morning carried a different kind of unease. The shapes remained perfectly still, even as waves crashed against the volcanic cliffs beneath them, and the longer the crews stared toward the island, the more difficult it became to decide whether they were looking at natural formations or something deliberately placed there long ago. Through shifting bands of sea mist and afternoon light, the distant figures seemed at first to resemble pillars rising naturally from the volcanic slopes. European sailors during the 18th century often encountered unfamiliar coastlines shaped by volcanic activity, and many islands in the Pacific presented strange rock formations visible from offshore. Yet the silhouettes standing across Easter Island appeared too upright and too evenly spaced to belong entirely to the landscape itself. As the ships slowly adjusted position offshore, the outlines sharpened against the hills behind them, revealing proportions that no longer resembled ordinary stone. Heads, shoulders, and elongated faces gradually emerged from the haze, and a silence settled across portions of the deck as crews realized they were looking at colossal human forms staring across the island. Confusion spread quietly across the Dutch ships once sailors realized the shapes carried the proportions of human faces. No records from Europe described monuments like these existing on an isolated island thousands of miles from continental civilization, and the sheer scale of the figures immediately disrupted ordinary assumptions about the people living there. Some of the moai visible from the coast stood several meters high, though the Europeans in 1722 had no precise measurements during their initial observations. Later archaeological studies would reveal that many statues weighed dozens of tons and had been carved primarily from compressed volcanic ash at the quarry of Rano-Raraku. None of that knowledge existed for Roggeveen's crews. From the ships, the figures simply appeared impossible. Across the barren coastline, enormous stone heads stood above the land, with an expressionless stillness that many aboard the expedition found difficult to ignore. Unlike ordinary statues positioned within cities or ceremonial centres familiar to Europeans, the moai seemed embedded directly into the island itself, as though the volcanic hills had produced faces instead of stone. Most were positioned inland upon ahu platforms connected to ancestral ceremonies and spiritual authority within Rapa Nui society, but sailors observing from offshore could not have understood those meanings. What they saw instead were giant human forms overlooking a remote island where resources already appeared scarce. The contrast between the empty terrain and the scale of the statues became one of the most unsettling features of the encounter. Unlike the wooden idols described elsewhere in the Pacific, the moai of Easter Island appeared immense, weathered, and impossibly heavy against the empty terrain surrounding them. The island itself lacked the dense forests Europeans expected to find in tropical regions, and many sections of the coastline appeared exposed beneath the sun and wind. Even from a distance, sailors could see broad volcanic slopes with relatively little tree cover, raising immediate questions about how such monuments had ever been transported across the island. Later researchers would debate the environmental decline of Rapa Nui for centuries, including theories involving deforestation and shifting resource systems, but the Europeans arriving in 1722 only recognised the contradiction before them. Somehow a remote island with limited visible resources contained hundreds of monumental carvings larger than anything many sailors had seen outside parts of Europe or Asia. Several crew members reportedly continued staring inland, even while carrying out ordinary landing preparations near the shore. Maritime expeditions during this era depended on discipline because unfamiliar coastlines carried constant danger from reefs, hostile encounters, disease, and navigational uncertainty. Yet the statues continued drawing attention away from routine tasks aboard the ships. The moai did not resemble decorations or symbols of celebration. Their faces appeared stern, detached, and strangely uniform despite variations in size and condition. Many featured long noses, heavy brows, and deep-set eye sockets that, in some cases, once held coral eyes, now largely absent by the time Europeans arrived. Without those eyes, the figures appeared hollow and distant, though perhaps no less unsettling. At certain angles along the coast, the statues seemed to emerge one after another from the hills, as the ship slowly adjusted position offshore. Easter Island contained hundreds of moai in varying stages of completion, transport and placement, though 18th century visitors could only grasp fragments of the island's full scale. Some figures remained standing upon ceremonial platforms, while others lay partially buried or abandoned near ancient roads connected to quarry routes. Because the terrain rose and fell unevenly, the movement of the ships created the illusion that new faces were constantly appearing across the island. Sailors rounding sections of the coastline encountered fresh silhouettes overlooking ridges and valleys, creating the impression that no part of the land existed beyond the reach of these stone figures. Beneath the fading light of evening, the stone faces lost their clear outlines and became towering silhouettes overlooking the island. Firelight from settlements near the shore occasionally flickered against the darkness, while the volcanic landscape behind the moai dissolved into shadow. Conditions aboard long-distance expeditions often amplified fear after sunset, because exhausted crews lived under constant strain from illness, storms, limited supplies, and uncertainty about unknown territories. Easter Island introduced another pressure entirely. The statues remained visible long after ordinary details of the coastline disappeared into darkness, causing the moai themselves to dominate the horizon at night. To sailors already shaped by superstition and religious anxiety, the enormous silhouettes carried a deeply unnatural presence. No explanation offered aboard the expedition fully answered the same disturbing question repeated among the crews. Who had moved these massive figures across such an isolated island? European engineering during the early 18th century depended heavily on timber, pulleys, animal labour, and large organised workforces for transporting heavy materials, yet Easter Island appeared to possess none of those advantages in obvious abundance. The mystery surrounding the moai, therefore, became inseparable from the horror they inspired. Sailors were not merely observing statues, they were confronting evidence of labour, planning, and social organisation on a scale they could not reconcile with the island before them. The monuments hinted at a past larger than the visible present, and that implication unsettled many of the Europeans who attempted to describe the island afterward. Fragments of volcanic rock, abandoned ceremonial platforms and weathered roads near the statues suggested that the island had once supported activity on a far greater scale. Although Roggeveen's expedition remained limited in what it could document during its brief stay, later European visitors such as James Cook and members of Spanish expeditions observed additional signs that parts of the island no longer functioned as they once had. Some Ahu platforms appeared damaged or neglected, and oral histories later recorded internal conflict between rival groups on the island. Yet for the first Europeans arriving offshore, those details remained fragmented impressions rather than coherent explanations. What mattered psychologically was the growing realization that the moai belonged to a civilization whose history already felt partially broken. While some of the moai still stood upright facing inland, others appeared partially damaged or separated from the stone platforms beneath them. Modern archaeological evidence indicates that many statues were deliberately toppled during periods of conflict after the height of moai construction, but 18th century sailors had no framework for interpreting what they saw. The mixture of standing and fallen figures created the appearance of gradual ruin, rather than stable ceremonial order. In some places, the statues seemed dominant and imposing, while elsewhere they resembled abandoned remnants scattered across volcanic ground. This inconsistency deepened the sense that the island existed in the aftermath of something destructive, that outsiders could neither identify nor fully understand. Centuries before archaeologists began studying the island in detail, European sailors were already carrying home deeply uneasy impressions of the giant watching faces. Accounts written after the voyage frequently focused on the extraordinary appearance of the statues because the moai overshadowed nearly every other feature of Easter Island in European memory. The figures challenged assumptions about isolation, civilization, engineering, and religion all at once. Some observers attempted rational explanations, while others quietly allowed fear and speculation to shape their understanding of the island. Over time, Easter Island became associated in European imagination not only with mystery, but with the haunting image of stone faces overlooking a remote world at the edge of the Pacific. The psychological effect of the moai lingered partly because the statues never appeared expressive enough to feel human, yet never appeared lifeless enough to feel entirely harmless. Their stillness became oppressive through repetition. No matter where sailors looked from the water, another face seemed visible somewhere beyond the cliffs or hills. The figures did not threaten movement, speech or attack, Yet their silence itself became unsettling because it did not explain why they existed in such numbers, so far from the rest of the known world. Even the islanders moving among them seemed smaller beneath the towering carvings of their ancestors, reinforcing the impression that the true presence dominating Easter Island was not the living population, but the monuments surrounding them. European ships eventually departed the island carrying supplies, observations, and fragmented reports back across the Pacific. Yet the memory that remained strongest for many sailors was not necessarily the violence on shore or the unfamiliar customs of the islanders. It was the overwhelming sensation of approaching an island already occupied by hundreds of silent faces, whose purpose nobody aboard the expedition could explain with certainty. Long after the volcanic coastline vanished behind the horizon, the Moai continued existing in memory as symbols of something unresolved, something ancient, and something disturbingly watchful hidden within the isolation of the Pacific Ocean. Even after the island disappeared behind the horizon, many aboard the ships could no longer shake the feeling that the stone faces had continued watching them leave. The villages that felt abandoned before dawn. Before sunrise fully reached the volcanic slopes of Easter Island, parts of the shoreline already seemed unusually quiet for an inhabited island. From the anchored European ships resting offshore during the 18th century, the land appeared awake in fragments rather than as a unified settlement preparing for another day. Thin light spread slowly across the ridges and crater edges, while the dark outlines of stone structures emerged beside the sea. Yet large sections of the coastline remained motionless for long stretches of time. After months crossing the Pacific, many sailors had expected dense activity near the shore once land was finally reached. Instead, the island gave off the unsettling impression of a place where something had already faded long before outsiders arrived to witness it. Few sounds emerged from the settlements visible near the coast, as European sailors continued scanning the land from anchored ships. In many ports visited during long expeditions, mornings began with smoke rising from cooking fires, groups gathering near the water, and constant movement between dwellings and canoes. Easter Island often appeared different in surviving expedition accounts. The inhabited areas seemed smaller and quieter than the enormous Moai overlooking them suggested they should have been. Even when islanders approached the Europeans or moved near the shoreline, the surrounding terrain still carried a strange emptiness that observers struggled to explain. The silence did not suggest abandonment in the absolute sense, but rather the remains of activity reduced over time. Along several footpaths leading inland, traces of regular activity appeared easier to find than the people themselves. Europeans exploring parts of the island encountered carefully placed stone walls, agricultural features, and low structures built partly into the ground to protect against strong winds, common across the exposed volcanic terrain. These dwellings, known today through archaeological study as Hapenga and other forms of domestic architecture, demonstrated planning and adaptation to difficult environmental conditions. Yet for some visitors, the settlements appeared scattered and thinly populated compared to the scale of ceremonial structures elsewhere on the island. The pathways suggested movement and organisation, but the surrounding quiet made it difficult to determine how many people still lived among them. Scattered clusters of low stone houses stood across portions of the island, yet many appeared occupied by surprisingly few inhabitants. When Jacob Roggeveen first recorded the island in 1722, estimates of the population varied widely, partly because European observers could only judge numbers from brief encounters near the coast. Later visitors, including James Cook, described conditions that appeared increasingly strained. Cook's expedition reached the island in 1774 and noted signs of poverty and limited resources that contrasted sharply with the monumental achievements represented by the Moai. Although historians continue debating the island's historical population size before European contact, the Europeans themselves consistently sensed a mismatch between the civilization implied by the statues and the smaller communities they actually encountered. What unsettled later visitors most was not evidence of sudden destruction, but the lingering impression that the island had gradually diminished over time. The horror of Easter Island did not emerge through ruins blackened by recent catastrophe or signs of recent warfare visible everywhere along the coast. Instead, the island produced the quieter and more difficult fear of decline. Ceremonial platforms still stood, villages remained inhabited, agricultural systems continued functioning in places. Yet much of what Europeans observed felt reduced from an earlier condition they could no longer see directly. The island carried visible signs of continuity and survival, alongside equally visible signs that something larger may once have existed there. Between the stone foundations and cooking pits near certain ceremonial areas, Europeans encountered signs that larger communities may once have gathered there. Archaeological evidence now shows that many Ahu platforms served as important ceremonial and social centres connected to ancestral worship within Rapa Nui society. Some supported multiple moai, while nearby areas contained evidence of repeated communal activity over long periods of time. To 18th century sailors unfamiliar with Polynesian traditions, however, these spaces often appeared strangely inactive compared to their monumental scale. The platforms suggested organised labour and social coordination involving large groups of people, but the surrounding settlements visible to Europeans no longer seemed capable of supporting such immense projects. That contradiction slowly became one of the island's deepest mysteries. Sparse vegetation across wide sections of Easter Island deepened the growing suspicion that the island's resources had become severely limited long before foreign ships arrived. Early European accounts repeatedly mentioned the island's lack of large trees, a detail that later became central to theories about environmental decline and deforestation. For sailors accustomed to seeing timber-rich islands across other parts of the Pacific, the exposed landscape of Easter Island appeared unusually barren. The absence of large canoes especially attracted attention because Polynesian societies elsewhere often depended heavily upon advanced seafaring traditions. European visitors observed smaller watercraft on the island, yet the scale of ocean travel associated with larger Polynesian voyaging canoes seemed largely absent. This absence added to the growing impression that the island had once possessed capabilities no longer fully visible. During later expeditions in the 18th century, observers such as James Cook described conditions that appeared harsher than many Europeans expected to find in Polynesia. Cook noted limited resources and described some islanders as physically thin, observations that contributed to European assumptions that Easter Island had undergone severe decline. Modern researchers continue debating the extent and causes of that decline, including environmental pressures, internal conflict, changing social systems, and the devastating effects of later outside contact. Yet for the Europeans themselves, the uncertainty surrounding the island became part of its psychological effect. They arrived expecting discovery, and instead encountered fragments of a society whose earlier history appeared partly erased. Near several Ahu platforms, the contrast between the enormous moai and the relatively small visible population became increasingly difficult for sailors to ignore. The statues dominated the landscape with expressions that appeared calm, detached, and ancient even during the 18th century. Some stood upright upon ceremonial platforms, while others had already fallen or become damaged. The people living nearby seemed connected to the monuments, yet also separated from the era that created them. European observers could not determine whether the moai represented a still functioning tradition or the surviving remains of something already collapsing. The uncertainty surrounding that question followed many crews long after their ships departed the island. Questions surrounding the island's past quietly followed European crews as they moved between settlements that felt active in some places and strangely hollow in others. Certain areas showed clear signs of continued habitation through cultivated gardens and maintained structures, yet wide stretches of coastline and interior terrain appeared almost empty beneath the looming presence of the moai. The horror of these villages did not come from visible corpses or direct violence. It came from the persistent feeling that too much space existed between the remaining signs of life. European sailors repeatedly sensed that they were witnessing only a reduced fragment of the island's former reality, without knowing what had caused the reduction. Even ordinary details, including limited canoe construction and the absence of large timber, contributed to the feeling that something important had already been lost on the island. Rapa Nui existed in one of the most isolated inhabited regions on Earth, located thousands of kilometers from continental landmasses and other major island groups. Sustaining life there required careful adaptation over centuries, yet by the time Europeans arrived, the island no longer reflected the image of a thriving maritime society many outsiders expected from Polynesia. The moai remained as overwhelming evidence of past organisation and engineering, but the settlements surrounding them appeared increasingly fragile by comparison. To European observers, the island resembled a place surviving in the shadow of its own history. By the time ships prepared to leave Easter Island, many sailors carried away the disturbing belief that they had not witnessed a thriving civilization, but the exhausted remains of one. The villages visible near the coast continued functioning, and the islanders themselves maintained traditions, ceremonies, and systems of survival, despite extraordinary isolation. Yet the emotional impression left upon many visitors was one of incompleteness. Everywhere the Europeans looked, signs of endurance existed besides signs of reduction. The island seemed inhabited, but not fully alive in the way its monumental past suggested it once had been. That contradiction lingered in expedition journals and maritime memory because nobody aboard the ships could fully explain when the change had begun, or what the island had looked like before the silence settled across so much of the land. The empty spaces between the villages seemed to trouble the Europeans long after the island itself had faded into the Pacific mist. The nights filled with drumming across the hills. A thin layer of darkness had already settled over Easter Island when the first distant sounds began reaching the anchored European ships. The ocean around Jacob Roggeveen's expedition had grown nearly featureless under nightfall, with only the faint outline of volcanic land remaining where earlier in the day the Moai had dominated the horizon. After hours of relative silence, the shift was not immediate or dramatic, but subtle, as though the island had begun revealing a different version of itself once visibility was taken away. The crews, already accustomed to long stretches of monotony at sea, did not initially agree on what they were hearing, and that uncertainty itself became the first layer of unease. Out beyond the reach of visible land, a slow rhythm started forming somewhere along the hidden contours of the island. At first, it could have been mistaken for the natural breaking of waves against rock, or the irregular settling of wind across uneven terrain, but the repetition carried a structure that did not belong to the ocean. 18th century sailors were familiar with the sounds of storms, reefs, and distant surf, yet this rhythm carried a different quality, something that suggested intention without revealing its source. The island, which during daylight hours had been defined by silent stone figures and empty-looking spaces, now seemed to respond only through sound, as though the darkness had removed everything except what could be heard. Far inland, faint bursts of firelight appeared intermittently between stretches of terrain that the sailors could no longer clearly distinguish. These lights did not remain steady enough to suggest permanent settlements, nor did they vanish completely like passing lightning or reflection. Instead, they flickered in scattered locations across the interior, briefly illuminating sections of the volcanic slopes before disappearing again into darkness. In Polynesian societies, fire was often central to communal gatherings, ceremonies, and daily survival, and although the Europeans could not interpret what they were witnessing with certainty, the presence of fire suggested that human activity was continuing beyond the shoreline in forms that remained partially hidden from view. Across the water, what sounded like human voices occasionally rose above the wind before dissolving back into the night. The distance distorted them beyond recognition, turning potential words into fragmented impressions that changed depending on where a listener stood on deck. Some sailors believed they heard chanting, while others dismissed it as wind interacting with uneven terrain, yet neither explanation fully resolved the consistency with which the sounds returned. Isolation at sea often heightened sensitivity to unfamiliar noise, and the absence of visual confirmation made every sound more significant than it might have seemed under normal conditions. Within hours of nightfall, several sailors stationed on deck began reporting movement-like patterns in the sounds carried from shore. Although nothing could be seen clearly beyond the water's edge, the shifting rhythm of drumming and intermittent calls created the impression that activity was occurring in multiple directions at once. The geography of Easter Island, shaped by volcanic ridges and uneven valleys, likely amplified and distorted sound in ways that made precise location difficult to determine from offshore. What remained consistent in the sailors' accounts was not clarity, but confusion that grew stronger the longer they listened. Unlike anything seen during daylight encounters, the island at night revealed itself only through shifting layers of sound rather than visible form. During the day, European observers had focused on Moai statues, sparse settlements, and the unusual distribution of human activity across the landscape. At night, all of those visual anchors disappeared, leaving only auditory fragments that refused to assemble into a coherent picture. The absence of sight transformed the island into something less stable in perception, where even familiar natural sounds could be reinterpreted as unfamiliar signals carrying meaning that could not be verified. From different points along the coastline, uneven drumming seemed to rise and fall without any consistent direction or source. Drumming is a well-documented element of Polynesian cultural expression, used in various contexts ranging from ceremony to communication, yet the Europeans had no framework for distinguishing its purpose in real time. The irregularity of the rhythm, combined with the distance over water, made it impossible for sailors to determine whether they were hearing coordinated gatherings, scattered groups, or unrelated sound sources amplified by terrain. The result was not understanding, but fragmentation, as each pulse of sound seemed to belong to a different part of the island. Between each surge of noise, long intervals of silence created an even deeper sense of uncertainty aboard the ships. Silence at sea is never absolute, but the contrast between sudden sound and sudden absence made each return of drumming feel more pronounced. Sailors on night watch often describe the sensation of waiting for the next sound rather than resting in the quiet, as though the island itself was controlling the rhythm of attention. The psychological effect was subtle but persistent, building not from intensity alone but from repetition without explanation. Occasional glimmers of torchlight near inland structures suggested activity continuing far beyond the range of European understanding. These brief illuminations did not provide clarity, but instead reinforced the separation between observer and observed. The moai and ceremonial platforms visible during the day now existed only as memory and assumption, while the night reduced everything to scattered points of fire and sound. Without knowledge of local customs or language, sailors could not distinguish whether what they were witnessing represented ordinary daily life, ceremonial gatherings, or something entirely different shaped by isolation. Extended isolation at sea had already weakened many of the crew, making each unfamiliar sound feel heavier in the darkness. Long Pacific voyages during the 18th century placed enormous strain on sailors through exhaustion, limited supplies, illness, and constant exposure to uncertain conditions. Under such circumstances, even ordinary environmental noise could become psychologically amplified. On Easter Island, however, the combination of isolation, unfamiliar acoustics, and fragmented perception created an environment where interpretation itself became unreliable. Without linguistic or cultural context, every distant rhythm and chant became something the sailors interpreted through fragments of fear and imagination. Historical accounts of early European encounters in the Pacific often reveal how quickly misunderstanding could shape perception, particularly in environments where communication was impossible. On this island, where visual reference points disappeared at night, the lack of understanding was not temporary but structural. The crews could hear activity but could not place it within any familiar framework, leaving space for uncertainty to grow unchecked. When the sounds finally faded toward the later hours of the night, the silence that followed felt just as unsettling as what had come before. There was no indication of conclusion or transition, only an abrupt reduction in sensory input that left sailors uncertain whether the activity had ended or simply moved beyond hearing range. The island remained present in darkness, but no longer offered any clues about what was occurring inland. That absence of confirmation became its own form of pressure, lingering longer than the sounds themselves. Something about those night sounds never stopped returning to the minds of the crew, long after Easter Island had disappeared behind the horizon. The toppled statues scattered across the earth. Sections of inland terrain revealed irregular breaks in the expected vertical order of stone figures long before any full explanation could be formed. From the perspective of European crews moving cautiously away from the coastline, the moai that had once defined the island's horizon in a strict upright rhythm now appeared interrupted in ways that did not immediately resolve into a clear pattern. The volcanic slopes of Rapa Nui, already marked by centuries of wind erosion and sparse vegetation, carried these monumental figures across ridges and plateaus in positions that seemed stable at a distance, but increasingly uncertain upon closer approach. Under the changing daylight, the island no longer appeared as a continuous arrangement of guardians, but as something fractured in its visual logic. What should have appeared as continuous silhouettes along the volcanic ridges instead showed intermittent interruptions in their upright presence. In earlier offshore observations during the arrival of Jacob Roggeveen in 1722, the moai were primarily understood as vertical forms dominating the inland skyline. Yet as inland movement brought sailors into closer proximity with the terrain, the consistency of that vertical order began to break. Some statues still stood in formal alignment upon their stone platforms, while others no longer occupied the positions that would have completed those arrangements. The interruption was not immediately readable as destruction, because the surrounding landscape did not display the abrupt devastation associated with storms or recent conflict. Instead, it suggested a slower, more layered alteration of placement that accumulated across time. Only after closer movement through the landscape did it become evident that several of the monumental forms were no longer standing as intended. The realization did not arrive as a single moment of shock, but as repeated confirmation, each new section of terrain reinforcing the same contradiction. Figures that had appeared upright from a distance were now seen lying against the volcanic ground, partially embedded in soil, or resting at angles that implied displacement rather than collapse from uniform force. The Moai, which earlier chapters had described as silent observers of the island, now revealed a second condition that fundamentally altered their perceived role in the landscape. Instead of uninterrupted guardianship, the island presented a mixture of presence and interruption that required continuous reinterpretation. A pattern began forming between upright statues and those lying against the ground that could not be accounted for by erosion alone. The distribution did not resemble the randomness of natural geological processes, where wind and time gradually reshape exposed surfaces without recognizable order. Instead, the arrangement suggested variation in direction, spacing, and positioning that implied multiple influences over time. Ceremonial platforms known as hu, constructed from carefully stacked stone and associated with ancestral practices within Rapa Nui society, appeared in different states of preservation across the same terrain. Some supported intact statues, while others stood empty, their absence more visually striking than the presence of those still complete. The inconsistency forced observers to confront the possibility that the landscape preserved more than a single historical moment. Ceremonial platforms constructed from stacked stone showed mismatched alignments that suggested prolonged alteration rather than a single disruptive event. Archaeological understanding developed long after these initial encounters confirms that many Ahu sites underwent phases of construction, modification, and reuse over extended periods of time. However, for the European crews encountering these formations directly, such temporal layering was not yet a structured concept. Instead, they perceived unevenness in the physical record without the framework to organize it chronologically. The platforms appeared simultaneously ancient and partially disrupted, as though their condition reflected more than one era occupying the same physical space. This overlap of states created a subtle but persistent disorientation. Repeated encounters with grounded figures gradually made it impossible to regard their positioning as accidental or isolated. The inland progression of the expedition revealed that fallen statues were not confined to a single area or slope, but appeared across multiple sections of the island's interior. Each instance reinforced the same unresolved tension between expectation and observation. The Moai, previously understood as stable and dominant features of the island's identity, now appeared divided between standing and grounded conditions without an immediately visible cause. The absence of explanatory continuity made it difficult for observers to categorize what they were seeing as either recent change or long-term transformation. What initially appeared as scattered ruin began to suggest, under sustained observation, a distribution shaped by multiple distinct episodes rather than one unified collapse. This recognition introduced a shift in interpretation that moved beyond simple observation of fallen statues. Instead of a single catastrophic moment, the landscape suggested a sequence of changes that may have occurred at different times and under different circumstances. Some statues lay in positions that indicated careful lowering, while others appeared more abruptly displaced. The variation in condition complicated any attempt to assign a singular cause, leaving only the impression of repeated interventions that had accumulated across the island's history without clear chronological markers. At that stage, the landscape ceased to resemble static remains, and instead presented itself as overlapping layers of placement and displacement occupying the same terrain. The island's interior no longer functioned as a single visible moment, but appeared as a composite of states that could not be fully separated by sight alone. Upright Moai, fallen figures, empty platforms, and partially buried forms all coexisted within the same field of observation, yet each suggested a different point in time. The effect was not dramatic in the sense of sudden revelation, but cumulative in its destabilization of certainty. The more the expedition advanced inland, the less reliable any single interpretation of the landscape became. interpretation became increasingly unstable, as neither environmental explanation nor immediate historical inference could fully account for what the expedition was recording. Wind erosion, seismic activity, and long-term geological change explained portions of the landscape's condition, but failed to account for the structured nature of many arrangements. At the same time, assumptions of conflict or rapid destruction did not align with the broader distribution of remains across the island. European observers were left navigating between partial explanations, none of which fully resolved the contradiction between the island's monumental architecture and its disrupted presentation. This uncertainty became a defining feature of their recorded impressions. Such accumulation of inconsistencies forced a gradual reassessment of how the island's ceremonial structures might have functioned before European arrival. The Moai were no longer understood solely as static figures dominating the horizon, but as elements within a broader system whose operational logic remained inaccessible to outside observers. The Ahu platforms, roads, and quarry sites indicated a level of coordination that exceeded what was visible in the island's present condition. Yet the relationship between that past system and the current arrangement of toppled and standing figures remained unresolved. The expedition moved through a landscape that seemed to retain evidence of organization without revealing its sequence. Stone foundations, partially buried beneath newer shifts in terrain, implied that what remained visible was only one fragment of a much longer sequence of transformation. Later, archaeological studies would confirm that Rapa Nui experienced complex phases of construction and restructuring over centuries, involving the transport of Moai from the quarry at Rano-Raraku and their placement across ceremonial platforms throughout the island. However, in the moment of European observation, these processes could only be inferred indirectly through scattered physical evidence. The layering of visible and partially obscured structures created a sense that the island had accumulated its present form through repeated alteration rather than a single defining moment. With continued inland progression, distinction itself weakened between what had fallen, what remained, and what could no longer be confidently placed within a single moment in time. The Moai ceased to function as stable reference points, and instead became indicators of uncertainty distributed across the landscape. Each new ridge or valley introduced variations in condition that resisted consolidation into a coherent narrative. The expedition's understanding of the island became increasingly dependent on incomplete visual information, with no external reference point capable of clarifying sequence or cause. The landscape did not resolve into clarity, but continued to expand the scope of what could not be confidently determined. A growing difficulty remained in separating the island's physical reality from the incomplete way it was being interpreted at every step. The caves filled with human bones. Irregular openings in the volcanic ground began drawing attention as inland exploration moved away from the more familiar coastal formations. What had initially been recorded by European crews as uneven terrain shaped by centuries of erosion gradually revealed a different kind of structure once closer inspection became unavoidable. The island's interior, already defined by its monumental stoneworks and scattered ceremonial sites, now appeared to contain voids that did not align with the expected solidity of volcanic rock. In the accounts associated with early contact periods following the voyage of Jacob Roggeveen in 1722, most attention had been directed toward the Moai and coastal settlements, leaving the subterranean landscape largely unexamined until later incidental discoveries brought it into focus. Depth beneath the surface proved more extensive than initial inspection suggested, with voids extending beyond what erosion alone would normally create. These openings were not immediately identifiable as caves in the conventional sense described in other Pacific islands, where natural cavities often form through predictable volcanic processes. Instead, the passages seemed to continue inward with an irregular persistence that defied simple classification. The sailors who approached these formations did so cautiously, often assuming at first that they were encountering shallow recesses or collapsed ground. Only when light failed to reach further into the darkness did it become apparent that the terrain extended beyond visual certainty. No longer confined to shallow depressions, the terrain revealed passage-like structures that interrupted the expected continuity of solid rock. The volcanic composition of Easter Island, shaped by ancient eruptions and hardened flows, typically produced stable formations that resisted deep hollowing, except under specific geological conditions. Yet here, the opening suggested channels that did not match superficial expectations of erosion patterns visible elsewhere on the island. Some passages narrowed abruptly, while others widened into enclosed chambers that could not be fully observed from the entrance. This inconsistency contributed to growing uncertainty about whether these spaces were entirely natural or altered in some way not yet understood by the observers. Visibility collapsed almost immediately once the first descent into the openings was attempted, forcing movement into a tightly enclosed space. Light sources carried by the expedition, limited to torches or small lanterns typical of 18th century maritime exploration, failed to illuminate more than a short distance ahead. Shadows absorbed detail quickly, and the uneven surfaces of the cave walls distorted depth perception. Movement became careful and deliberate, guided more by touch and incremental progress than by visual confirmation. In this environment, even small shifts in footing or airflow carried heightened significance, reinforcing the sense that the underground environment operated under conditions entirely separate from the world above. Human remains appeared intermittently along the underground path, though their placement offered no immediate narrative of origin or sequence. The bones were not presented in a manner that immediately clarified whether they represented deliberate burial, secondary placement, or displacement over time. Some fragments were partially embedded within sediment, while others rested on exposed surfaces where they had clearly remained undisturbed for extended periods. Without a cultural context or interpretive framework, the sailors could only record what was visible without fully understanding its arrangement. The presence of human remains underground introduced a level of interpretive tension that contrasted sharply with the island's already complex surface landscape. Skeletal fragments, distributed across multiple sections of the cave system, suggested repeated deposition rather than singular placement. This distribution created the impression that the underground environment had been used over time in ways that left layered physical traces. In Polynesian contexts broadly, burial practices have historically included a range of methods influenced by geography, tradition, and resource availability, including the use of caves in certain regions for interment or concealment. However, the European crews lacked the cultural framework to distinguish intentional arrangement from natural accumulation, leaving them to interpret patterns without certainty. The repetition of remains across different sections of the cave system deepened the ambiguity rather than resolving it. Unlike anything recorded on the island's surface, underground conditions removed all reliable reference points for distance or direction. Above ground, the moai, ahu platforms and volcanic ridges provided orientation markers that allowed for relative spatial understanding even in unfamiliar terrain. Beneath the surface, those markers disappeared entirely, replaced by continuous stone and narrowing corridors that offered no external frame of reference. The absence of orientation contributed to a psychological shift among those who entered, as time and distance became increasingly difficult to judge. In such conditions, even short movements felt extended, and spatial memory became unreliable almost immediately. Uncertainty grew among the expedition members as the distinction between a natural cavity and a constructed burial space became increasingly difficult to maintain. Some passages appeared too structured to be entirely the result of natural formation, while others lacked the clear geometry typically associated with intentional construction. This ambiguity forced observers to consider multiple possibilities simultaneously without being able to confirm any of them. The island's surface had already challenged European interpretation through its monumental stone figures and fragmented settlement patterns, but the underground environment removed even the minimal clarity provided by visible context. Everything below the surface existed without immediate explanation. Accumulated remains in deeper sections complicated any attempt to establish whether the environment reflected burial practice or geological entrapment. Layers of material suggested prolonged interaction between human activity and natural processes, though the sequence of that interaction remained unclear. Some areas appeared to contain concentrated deposits, while others held isolated fragments without apparent connection to the surrounding space. The lack of a consistent arrangement prevented any straightforward categorization of the environment. Instead of presenting a singular function, the cave system appeared to contain multiple overlapping possibilities that resisted consolidation into a single interpretation. European interpretive frameworks, built around surface burial customs, failed to fully account for the structural irregularity observed underground. Burial practices familiar to the crews typically involved clearly marked graves or designated sites, often with visible markers or identifiable boundaries. The subterranean conditions of Easter Island did not conform neatly to these expectations, leaving observers without reliable analogues for comparison. This mismatch between expectation and observation created a gap that could not easily be resolved through immediate reasoning. The underground environment required a conceptual flexibility that the expedition could not fully supply at the moment of discovery. Attempts to impose familiar explanations weakened as the spatial arrangement of bones resisted alignment with known cultural patterns. The longer the expedition members remained within the cave system, the more difficult it became to maintain any single interpretive model. Each new section introduced variations that contradicted earlier assumptions, preventing the formation of a stable conclusion. The experience was not one of sudden revelation, but of gradual erosion of certainty, where each observed detail undermined previous interpretations. This accumulation of unresolved observations shaped the underground environment into something that defied immediate classification. Return to the surface did not fully release the impression left by the enclosed spaces, which continued to shape later observations of the island. The contrast between the confined underground environment and the open volcanic landscape above created a lasting psychological division in how the island was perceived. Even when attention returned to Moai, villages, and coastal formations, the memory of hidden passages persisted as an unresolved layer beneath those visible structures. The island no longer existed solely in its surface expression, but also in the implied space below it, where interpretation had broken down into uncertainty. The island's interior no longer felt limited to what could be seen, as though another version of its history existed just beneath reach without ever becoming fully accessible. The islanders who seemed to be starving. Accounts from Captain James Cook's 1774 encounter describe an immediate impression focused less on the landscape than on the condition of the people themselves. When HMS Resolution and HMS Adventure reached Easter Island during Cook's second Pacific voyage, the expedition's attention, as recorded in surviving journals and later compiled accounts, was quickly drawn toward the visible state of the island's inhabitants rather than its already noted monumental stone architecture. The Moai had been documented in earlier European visits as extraordinary in scale and placement, yet what Cook's crew emphasized in their observations was not the mystery of the statues at first glance, but the contrast between those structures and the physical condition of the people living among them. The encounter shifted attention from stone to human presence in a way that framed the island not only as a place of construction, but as a place of scarcity. Among the most consistent observations recorded by members of the expedition was the limited physical strength apparent among many of the island's inhabitants. The journals associated with Cook's voyage, including those of officers and naturalists aboard the ships, describe individuals who appeared affected by hardship in a manner that stood out to European observers accustomed to other Polynesian societies encountered during the same expedition route. These impressions were shaped by comparison, as Cook's earlier travels had brought him into contact with islands where agriculture, fishing, and resource distribution appeared more visibly abundant. On Easter Island, however, the same observers recorded a different pattern, one in which signs of sustained nutritional strain were frequently noted, though always through the interpretive lens of 18th century European maritime perception. What the crew noted with particular unease was the contrast between visible human scarcity and the immense stone figures positioned across the island. The Moai, distributed along ridges and ceremonial platforms known today as ahu, stood as remnants of an architectural tradition that clearly required extensive coordination, labour, and long-term resource management. Yet in the same visual field, the living population appeared comparatively small in number and reduced in apparent physical condition. This juxtaposition created a cognitive tension for observers who struggled to reconcile how such monumental works could coexist with what they interpreted as limited human capacity in the present. The island presented no obvious explanation that could immediately resolve this contradiction. Descriptions from the voyage repeatedly emphasized a sense of reduced abundance in daily life when compared with other Polynesian societies encountered during the same era. Cook's expedition had already observed a wide range of island environments across the Pacific, each with differing degrees of agricultural productivity, fishing access, and resource distribution. In that broader context, Easter Island appeared distinctive not only for its isolation, but also for the perceived limitations in visible food production. the crew recorded impressions of restricted cultivation areas and comparatively modest yields, though such observations were necessarily constrained by the limited duration and scope of their visit. These accounts reflect perception rather than a comprehensive survey, yet they nonetheless shaped early European interpretations of the island's condition. In contrast to the monumental scale of the Moai, the surrounding settlements appeared to reflect a more constrained pattern of material availability. Domestic structures, agricultural plots, and day-to-day subsistence activities, as observed from the expedition's limited interactions, did not present the same visual intensity as the ceremonial architecture. The island's engineering achievements stood in sharp relief against the apparent simplicity of everyday life as perceived by the visitors. This contrast did not suggest the absence of life or organization, but rather a disparity in scale between inherited monumental history and contemporary visible practice. For the European crews, this created an impression of temporal imbalance within the same inhabited space. Reports from the expedition indicated that food sources and cultivated areas seemed limited in comparison to the labour once required to construct the island's ceremonial structures. While later anthropological understanding recognises the complexity of Rapa Nui agricultural systems, including techniques adapted to volcanic soil and environmental constraints, the 18th century observers interpreted what they saw through the framework of their own agricultural expectations. Cook's crew, familiar with cultivated abundance in other Pacific regions, recorded their perception of relative scarcity without the benefit of ecological or historical context that might have explained long-term adaptation strategies. As a result, their observations emphasized what appeared to be missing rather than what was functionally present within the island's subsistence systems. Historical accounts suggest that the living population existed in a state that did not visibly match the scale of the engineering achievements scattered across the terrain. The Moai, some of which reached several meters in height and weighed many tons, implied a historical capacity for coordinated labor and sustained resource allocation that far exceeded what was immediately visible during European contact. This perceived mismatch became a recurring theme in early written descriptions of the island, where the grandeur of ancestral construction stood in contrast to the modesty of contemporary habitation, as interpreted by outsiders. The resulting impression was not one of contradiction alone, but of temporal disjunction, as though the island's past and present were not aligned in scale. For observers unfamiliar with the island's environmental conditions, the relationship between land resources and human presence appeared difficult to reconcile. The volcanic landscape of Rapa Nui, shaped by long-term geological processes and ecological isolation, presents natural limitations that would have required significant adaptation over centuries of human settlement. However, in the moment of European observation, such long-term ecological dynamics were not yet understood in detail. The crew's interpretation was therefore shaped by immediate visual comparison rather than extended environmental analysis. This limitation influenced how scarcity and abundance were perceived within the context of the island's broader cultural and historical framework. Cook's crew frequently recorded the impression that earlier generations must have possessed significantly greater organisational capacity than those encountered in 1774. This inference arose directly from the visible contrast between monumental stone architecture and the more modest scale of contemporary settlement life, as observed during the expedition's brief contact period. The assumption of decline or transformation was not uncommon in early European accounts of Pacific islands, where unfamiliar social systems were often interpreted through linear models of rise and reduction. In the case of Easter Island, this interpretive tendency contributed to the perception that the island's monumental past belonged to a different level of societal capability than its present condition. The disparity between ancestral monuments and present-day living conditions became one of the most persistent points of reflection among European observers. The Moai were not simply decorative or incidental structures. They represented a coordinated cultural and engineering system whose scale suggested deep historical continuity. Yet the people encountered during Cook's visit appeared to exist within a more constrained material environment, producing a tension that could not easily be resolved through immediate observation. This tension did not imply a judgment of capability, but rather a difficulty in aligning visible evidence with inherited assumptions about how societies develop and maintain large-scale construction over time. Interpretations of scarcity, whether accurate or shaped by limited understanding, intensified the sense that the island's present state differed sharply from its past. The records left by Cook's expedition do not provide a complete environmental or demographic picture, but they do preserve the subjective impressions of European sailors encountering a society under conditions they did not fully comprehend. These impressions, filtered through comparison with other islands and shaped by the constraints of brief observation, contributed to early narratives that framed Easter Island as a place of disproportion between monumental heritage and contemporary life. The resulting perception became one of the most enduring aspects of early European descriptions of the island. Even after leaving visual contact with the island, the contrast between immense stone constructions and fragile human presence remained difficult for the expedition to fully reconcile. The experience did not resolve into a single conclusion, but instead persisted as a set of unresolved observations carried forward in journals and recollections. The island, as recorded through Cook's voyage, remained defined not only by what was seen directly, but by the tension between what could be measured in stone and what could be inferred about the human condition in the present moment of contact. A lingering uncertainty remained about how a society capable of producing such monumental works could appear so diminished within the same landscape. The rituals Europeans were never meant to see. Beyond the limits of sustained European observation, certain island ceremonies were repeatedly acknowledged as existing without ever being fully documented. Early accounts from contact period voyages to Rapa Nui, later known as Easter Island, consistently describe moments where structured human activity was perceived at the edge of visibility, yet never fully entered into clear or continuous observation. The island had already been defined in European records by its monumental moai, scattered settlements, and volcanic terrain shaped by isolation in the southeastern Pacific. Yet alongside these more stable points of reference existed descriptions of gatherings and movements that seemed to occur outside the reach of sustained scrutiny, not because they were hidden in a dramatic sense, but because distance, timing, and restricted access repeatedly interrupted the possibility of complete understanding. Fragments of description that survive from early contact records suggest that full visibility of these events was never consistently achieved. Expedition journals associated with early European encounters, including later reflections on voyages such as those involving Jacob Roggeveen in 1722, and subsequent visits before the arrival of Captain James Cook, indicate that certain cultural activities were observed only in passing. These accounts do not present structured explanations of ritual systems, but instead preserve intermittent impressions shaped by viewing constraints, environmental distance, and the limitations of language. What emerges from these fragments is not a coherent description of ceremony, but a record of incomplete access to something understood to be culturally significant by the island's inhabitants. Held at a distance from coastal vantage points, activity associated with ceremonial gatherings appeared only in partial and interrupted form. European crews often remained outside designated areas of cultural importance, not necessarily through confrontation, but through spatial separation that limited direct participation or close observation. From these positions, movement could be seen without context, and organisation could be inferred without confirmation. The result was a pattern of perception in which action appeared structured but remained incomplete, as though only the outer edges of larger events were visible. The island's social and ceremonial life, therefore, entered European awareness not as a full system, but as a series of fragments separated by distance. Only through brief and unstable moments of clarity did sailors register movements that seemed coordinated yet deliberately out of reach. These moments were often shaped by changing vantage points, shifting light conditions, or the brief alignment of position between observer and activity. In such instances, groups of individuals could be seen assembling or dispersing in ways that suggested order, yet the absence of continuity prevented any reliable reconstruction of sequence. The impression left in written accounts was not of chaos, but of partial intelligibility, where meaning appeared momentarily before dissolving again into distance and obstruction. Restricted proximity to designated ceremonial spaces consistently prevented direct access to the core of observed activity. Accounts from multiple voyages suggest that certain areas of the island were approached only to a limited degree, with further movement either unnecessary, impractical, or culturally inappropriate from the perspective of both visitors and inhabitants. These boundaries created observational limits that shaped European understanding of island practices. Without direct entry into these spaces, interpretation remained dependent on what could be seen from the periphery, reinforcing a pattern in which visibility and comprehension were permanently misaligned. Unlike the stone monuments and settlement structures that could be approached directly, these events dissolved whenever observers attempted closer inspection. The Moai and Ahu platforms, already central to European interpretations of Rapa Nui, provided stable physical references that could be measured, drawn, and recorded. In contrast, the activities associated with living cultural practice did not present the same permanence of form. Instead, they existed within conditions of movement, timing, and controlled access that resisted fixed documentation. This difference contributed to a growing sense among European observers that not all aspects of the island's life could be captured through direct encounter alone. Repeated accounts emphasize that perception itself became unreliable when attempting to distinguish ritual action from ordinary movement at the edges of visibility. Without clear linguistic translation or full participation in local social frameworks, expedition members relied heavily on visual interpretation. Yet distance, partial obstruction, and unfamiliar cultural context made it difficult to determine whether what was being observed belonged to ceremonial structure, daily activity, or transitional states between the two. This instability of interpretation did not stem from the absence of information, but from the inability to anchor that information within a familiar system of meaning. In the absence of linguistic translation, every observed detail was filtered through uncertainty rather than confirmed understanding. Communication barriers during early European contact with Rapa Nui limited access to explanations that might have clarified the purpose or structure of what was being witnessed. As a result, observation operated independently from comprehension, producing records that captured appearance without necessarily capturing intent. This separation between seeing and understanding became one of the defining features of early written accounts, shaping how later readers would interpret the same encounters. Delayed interpretation among expedition members produced shifting explanations that never stabilized into a single coherent account. As notes and recollections were compared, differences in emphasis and detail emerged, reflecting the subjective nature of brief and partial observation. Some descriptions suggested structured ceremonial organization, while others emphasized ambiguity or incompleteness. Over time, these variations did not resolve into consensus, but instead accumulated as parallel interpretations that coexisted without full reconciliation. The result was a layered record in which certainty remained permanently deferred. Efforts by certain expedition members to approach closer to the gatherings were met with a maintained distance that prevented full entry into the ceremonial space. This maintained separation, whether intentional or situational, ensured that observation remained indirect. In practical terms, it meant that European crews often remained observers rather than participants, confined to positions that allowed only partial visibility of events occurring beyond their immediate reach. The boundary between observer and observed thus remained intact, preserving a structural limitation that shaped every subsequent interpretation. Across multiple recorded encounters, the inability to complete a full visual account left consistent gaps in the expedition's understanding of ceremonial structure. These gaps were not necessarily interpreted as an absence of activity, but rather as an absence of access. What was missing from the record was not the recognition of significance, but the ability to fully document its form. As a result, the island's ceremonial life entered European records as something partially perceived, never fully stabilized into descriptive clarity, and always accompanied by an awareness of incomplete observation. Recollections recorded later during the voyage continued to carry the imprint of incomplete perception, shaping how those encounters were mentally reconstructed long after direct contact had ended. The persistence of these impressions suggests that what unsettled observers was not simply what they had seen, but the realization that what they had seen never constituted a complete version of the events themselves, meaning never settled into a complete form when reconstructed from fragments that had never been fully seen in the first place. The cliffs where men risked death for power, sheer volcanic edges surrounding Rano Kau fall so abruptly that Orongo appears positioned less on land than on the boundary of collapse itself. The settlement associated with the Birdman tradition occupies a narrow ridge where the interior of the crater opens toward the ocean, creating a landscape in which elevation is not simply geographic but structural to the way human activity was organised. Early European contact accounts, recorded during and after voyages such as those of Captain James Cook in the 1770s, describe this region not as a place of ordinary habitation, but as one shaped by constant exposure to vertical risk and distant horizons. Even before the details of the Birdman system were fully understood, the positioning of Orongo alone suggested a form of social life tied to extreme spatial conditions. Positioning the settlement between the crater rim and open ocean created a spatial condition repeatedly noted in early descriptions of the site. The inner edge of Rano Kau forms a massive volcanic basin, while the outer edge drops toward cliffs that descend sharply to the sea below, producing a natural configuration where movement in any direction implies exposure to height, distance, or instability. European observers arriving with limited knowledge of Rapa Nui social organisation recorded this geography as unusual even by Pacific standards, where coastal and inland settlements typically maintain more gradual transitions between elevation zones. At Orongo, however, the transition was abrupt, and the settlement itself seemed to exist within a narrow band of inhabitable ground suspended between two forms of void. Recorded fragments of the Birdman competition describe a system in which political authority depended on acts of controlled descent and retrieval. The ritual known in later ethnographic accounts as the Tangata Manu competition structured leadership succession around a sequence of physical challenges tied to the seasonal nesting of sooty terns on offshore islets. Participants were required to descend the cliffs of Rano Kau, reach the shoreline, and then navigate open water toward islands such as Motu Nui, where the first retrieved egg of the season determined the emergence of a new Birdman figure. European accounts do not always preserve the internal cultural meaning of these actions, but they consistently emphasize the combination of danger, timing, and structured competition that defined the process. Stone dwellings aligned along the crater rim formed an observational line from which movements toward the ocean could be monitored without direct participation. These structures at Orongo, built from carefully fitted stone slabs, are positioned in a way that suggests prolonged attention toward the offshore horizon and the cliff descent routes below. From this elevated alignment, observers could watch the initiation of the ritual sequence, though participation was restricted to designated individuals. The architectural arrangement implies a society in which observation and action were deliberately separated, with certain individuals remaining in positions of oversight, while others undertook the physical demands of the competition below. Succession of leadership on the island followed an annual cycle in which physical endurance determined access to authority rather than inherited position. Unlike hereditary systems of governance familiar to many European observers, the Birdman tradition tied political status to a single cycle of competition that reset annually. The winner of the egg retrieval ritual would assume a position of authority for the year, linking survival, timing, and success in a physically demanding task directly to governance. This structure, recorded in later ethnographic summaries and oral traditions preserved after European contact, represents a system in which political legitimacy was not static, but continuously redefined through repeated risk. Governance through competition replaced stability with a process where survival and timing became measurable components of political outcome. Within this framework, authority was not a fixed inheritance, but a condition produced through performance under extreme environmental and physical pressure. European interpretations of this system, when they first encountered descriptions of it, struggled to reconcile the idea that leadership could be determined through an act that combined athletic endurance, environmental exposure, and navigational precision. The result was a form of governance that appeared inseparable from risk, where authority emerged only through successful passage across conditions that carried inherent danger. Cliffside descent toward the shoreline is repeatedly emphasized in accounts as the most dangerous phase of the ritual sequence. The descent from Orongo down the slopes of Rano Kau involves steep volcanic rock formations that drop sharply toward the ocean, and historical descriptions consistently highlight the physical difficulty of this movement. Participants in the Birdman competition were required to navigate this terrain under time-sensitive conditions, adding urgency to an already hazardous route. European observers, when later interpreting these accounts, often focused on this descent as the point at which ritual structure and physical danger became indistinguishable. Ocean crossings toward offshore islets such as Motu Nui required navigation under conditions that combined distance, timing, and physical vulnerability. Once participants reached the shoreline, they faced open water separating the main island from smaller rocky outcrops where seabirds nested seasonally. The journey across this water was not merely a passage but a continuation of the competition itself, extending the ritual structure into an environment where currents, waves, and exhaustion introduced additional uncertainty. In European descriptions, this phase is often noted as an extension of the cliff descent, transforming land-based risk into maritime exposure. Single object retrieval from the nesting grounds carried consequences that extended beyond individual success into the structure of annual leadership. The retrieval of a single egg from the nesting sites on Rapa Nui determined not only the outcome of the competition, but also the designation of the birdman for that year. This act, simple in physical description yet complex in its implications, linked survival and success directly to political authority. The concentration of such significance into a single object introduced a level of pressure that European accounts frequently struggled to contextualize within familiar governance models. Reconciliation of this system with European models of governance proved difficult due to its integration of risk and authority within the same act. In most European political frameworks of the 18th century, leadership was separated from direct physical danger, instead maintained through institutional succession, inheritance, or administrative appointment. The birdman system of Rapa Nui, as understood through later ethnographic summaries, did not separate these elements, but fused them into a single annual process. This structural difference created interpretive friction for early observers who could describe the events but not easily align them with known political categories. Stone dwellings positioned along Orongo's rim suggest a deliberate orientation toward observation, rather than participation in the events below. The architectural layout of the settlement indicates that certain spaces were intended for viewing the ritual sequence as it unfolded across cliffs, shoreline, and offshore islands. This arrangement implies a division of roles within the society, where some individuals observed and interpreted, while others undertook the physical risks of competition. The settlement itself, therefore, functioned not only as a residential space, but also as a structured point of oversight within the broader ritual system. Expedition records continue to show gaps between what was directly observed during contact and what later descriptions assumed about the ritual system's full structure. These gaps are not unusual in early contact ethnography, particularly in environments where language barriers, restricted access, and brief observation periods limited the completeness of recorded information. In the case of Orongo and the birdman tradition, much of what was documented by European observers reflects partial visibility of a system that operated on annual cycles and restricted participation. The resulting accounts preserve both observation and uncertainty, without fully resolving the relationship between them. Authority and survival remained inseparable in accounts that described leadership emerging only through exposure to conditions that could not guarantee return. The island is taken away by foreign ships. The arrival of foreign ships near Rapa Nui did not always announce itself with the clarity of conquest or formal contact, but often with a slower unfolding of events that only later revealed their true weight. Where initial exchanges of goods, gestures, and curiosity gradually gave way to patterns of movement that the islanders could not easily interpret, and which the crews themselves rarely documented in full detail. What began as sporadic contact across the vast Pacific would, in certain documented cases during the 19th century, shift into a far more unsettling pattern, where the same vessels that appeared as symbols of trade or exploration also became instruments of disappearance, and where individuals from the island were taken beyond sight of the shoreline and never returned in any recorded form that reached back to their families. The ocean, which had always defined Rapa Nui's isolation, began to function differently under these conditions, no longer just as a boundary but as a corridor through which people could be removed without a trace that the island itself could verify. By the mid-19th century, this transformation had become most visibly associated with the wider Peruvian labour system operating across parts of the Pacific, where ships engaged in the recruitment of labourers for guano extraction islands and other remote industrial sites, often under coercive or deceptive conditions that contemporary accounts later struggled to fully reconcile. In 1862 and 1863, a series of Peruvian vessels operating in the Pacific conducted raids across multiple Polynesian islands, a campaign that came to be broadly described as blackbirding, during which an estimated several thousand Pacific Islanders were taken into forced labour arrangements under conditions that were frequently indistinguishable from outright kidnapping. Within this broader pattern, Rapa Nui was not spared, and accounts preserved in later missionary records and colonial correspondence describe how islanders were taken aboard ships that had initially arrived under the appearance of trade or recruitment, only for those individuals to disappear into systems of labour far removed from any possibility of return. The impact of these removals on Easter Island was not merely numerical but deeply structural, because the individuals taken were often those who carried knowledge of lineage, ritual practice, and ecological management, meaning that each disappearance created a gap that extended beyond the personal into the cultural framework of the island itself. Oral histories later recorded by missionaries such as Eugène Hérault and others who reached the island in the 1860s and 1870s reflect a recurring pattern of absence, where families could identify those who had left with ships but had no confirmed information regarding their fate, and where the absence of communication from the outside world reinforced the perception that departure itself had become a form of permanent loss. The uncertainty surrounding these events deepened the psychological rupture between island life and the expanding maritime networks that surrounded it, as ships that once represented distant contact now became associated with irreversible separation. One of the most significant documented episodes connected to this pattern involved the Peruvian labour raids of 1862-1863, during which multiple Polynesian populations were targeted, and while Rapa Nui sources are fragmentary, surviving records indicate that a portion of the island's population was taken during this period under conditions that later diplomatic and missionary reports condemned as coercive and destabilising. The consequences were compounded by the fact that those who were taken were not simply labourers in a narrow economic sense, but members of tightly interwoven social systems, where kinship and knowledge transmission depended on continuity, and where the removal of even a small number of individuals could alter the balance of survival on an already isolated island. When ships departed after these events, they did so without returning those who had been taken, leaving behind a silence that grew heavier with each passing season, as no structured mechanism existed to trace or recover the missing. The horror described in later accounts does not rest only in the act of removal itself, but in the ambiguity that surrounded it, because islanders who witnessed these departures often had no framework through which to interpret whether what they were seeing was trade, coercion, or something entirely outside their previous experience, while European and Peruvian documentation from the same period often reframed the same events through language that minimized coercion or emphasized labor agreements that, in practice, were not fully understood by those involved. This divergence between observation and record created a layered uncertainty that made it difficult even decades later to reconstruct the exact circumstances under which individuals left the island, and this lack of clarity became part of the broader historical weight carried by Rapa Nui's 19th century encounters. As these events accumulated, the ships themselves began to acquire a dual presence in the island's memory, still associated with goods and occasional contact, but increasingly marked by the absence of those who had been taken away, so that every arrival carried with it an unspoken question of whether departure would mean return or disappearance. In later missionary descriptions, there are references to the reluctance of some islanders to approach foreign vessels after earlier incidents, not necessarily as a rejection of contact itself, but as a cautious response shaped by previous losses that had never been resolved or explained. The sea, once a space of openness, began to hold within it a growing sense of unpredictability that altered how proximity to ships was experienced on shore. At the same time, the broader Pacific labour networks continued to expand, with ships moving between islands under commercial and colonial systems that were often poorly regulated and inconsistently enforced, meaning that abuses could occur across vast distances with limited oversight. In this environment, Rapa Nui's extreme isolation did not protect it, but instead made it more vulnerable when contact did occur, because verification, communication, and accountability mechanisms were largely absent once a ship left the horizon. Those taken from the island were absorbed into systems where records were incomplete or lost, and where the possibility of tracing individuals across thousands of kilometres of ocean became effectively impossible for those left behind. The psychological impact of these disappearances is reflected indirectly in later descriptions of the island's social atmosphere, where missionaries noted not only demographic decline, but also a changed emotional register in how contact with outsiders was approached, suggesting that memory of earlier removals persisted even as new interactions took place. The arrival of ships could no longer be interpreted as a single event with predictable outcomes, but rather as an uncertain threshold where presence and absence were closely linked, and where the act of boarding a vessel carried implications that extended far beyond immediate visibility. This ambiguity contributed to a broader sense of instability that shaped how Rapa Nui communities engaged with external forces during the latter half of the 19th century. What makes the historical record particularly haunting is that, even in documents produced by European observers, there is an acknowledgement that communication barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and coercive recruitment practices were widespread across the Pacific during this period, even if the specific details regarding Rapa Nui remain incomplete. The Peruvian government eventually came under international criticism for the labour raids of the early 1860s, and reforms were attempted, but by then the damage to many island populations had already been done, and the return of survivors from labour sites across the Pacific did not erase the absence of those who never came back. On Rapa Nui, where population numbers were already limited and social cohesion deeply interdependent, even small losses carried amplified consequences that could not easily be absorbed or replaced. As time passed, the memory of these removals became intertwined with the broader narrative of foreign contact, so that ships themselves were no longer perceived only as agents of trade or exploration, but as unpredictable forces capable of permanently altering the fabric of the island's population in ways that could not be undone by later arrivals. The horizon, which had once marked the boundary of the known world, became instead a space of unresolved departure, where the act of seeing a sail on the water no longer implied any certainty about what would follow, and in that lingering uncertainty, where the sea still carried the possibility of arrival but no guarantee of return, the shoreline remained fixed in place, while everything that crossed it seemed to vanish into something the island could never fully account for: the diseases that became visible after first contact. In later historical reconstructions of Rapa Nui's early contact period, it becomes clear that the most consequential changes were not immediately perceptible to those experiencing them, as the surface of daily life continued to appear stable despite deeper disruptions already taking shape beneath it. Early interactions with European and other foreign vessels did not initially present themselves as moments of transformation in any obvious sense. Since exchanges still occurred in familiar forms, brief observations were recorded, and the island's routines continued within patterns that had developed long before sustained contact. Yet within these seemingly ordinary intervals, later observers would identify the earliest conditions through which disease was introduced, not as a visible event, but as an embedded consequence of proximity that no one on the island had the means to recognize at the time. During the initial encounters with foreign vessels and visitors, there was little within the immediate experience of island life that suggested an irreversible shift, as exchanges still appeared limited to material contact and brief periods of observation. The arrival of ships in the 19th century brought new forms of interaction, including trade goods and intermittent missionary presence. But these elements alone did not immediately signal biological consequences, especially within a population that had no prior exposure to many of the pathogens carried across distant ocean routes. In this early phase, what would later be understood as the introduction of epidemic disease remained indistinguishable from ordinary contact, and the absence of immediate large-scale mortality contributed to the perception that nothing fundamental had yet changed. Unrecorded in the earliest perceptions of those present was the subtle introduction of conditions that would only later be interpreted as the beginning of widespread illness, emerging in ways that did not initially present themselves as connected events. In many isolated island societies across the Pacific during the 19th century, introduced diseases such as influenza, measles, and smallpox were known to produce rapid and severe effects due to the lack of prior immunity. And while Rapa Nui's specific documented records are fragmented, missionary accounts from later in the century consistently describe periods of sudden and unexplained illness following contact with outsiders. These accounts rarely begin with certainty, but instead with observations of weakening health that could not yet be clearly categorized within any established framework of understanding. Within this context, what becomes particularly significant is not only the presence of illness, but the way in which its appearance often followed patterns of renewed contact, where intervals of apparent stability were interrupted by sudden shifts in physical condition across multiple individuals. Small clusters of cases, initially separated in time and place, began to suggest a broader connection that was not immediately visible at the moment of observation, especially given the absence of coordinated medical recording or systematic health assessment during early contact periods. Even basic distinctions between different types of sickness were difficult to establish consistently, leaving observers to rely on outward signs alone, such as fatigue, weakness, or inability to continue normal activity. Over time, these signs accumulated into a record that only later could be read as part of a larger pattern, rather than isolated occurrences. Only in retrospect did patterns begin to emerge across scattered observations, where isolated cases of weakness and sudden decline were reinterpreted as part of a broader and previously unrecognized sequence of physical deterioration. What had first appeared as unrelated episodes of fatigue or localized illness gradually revealed a pattern of recurrence, especially in the wake of repeated contact events, where different groups within the population began to show similar symptoms within overlapping timeframes. The difficulty in recognizing this pattern at the time was compounded by the absence of medical classification systems capable of identifying introduced pathogens in a remote setting, leaving interpretation dependent on observation alone rather than diagnostic confirmation. As additional contact continued across successive arrivals, the frequency of visible illness increased to a point where it could no longer be dismissed as a coincidence, and what had once appeared fragmented began to align into an observable trajectory. Historical accounts from broader Polynesia during this era show that disease outbreaks often followed the movement of ships between islands, with each new arrival carrying the potential to introduce conditions that spread rapidly through populations lacking immunity. On Rapa Nui, this dynamic would have been intensified by geographic isolation and limited population size, where even a relatively small number of infections could alter the demographic balance in a noticeably short period of time. Within a relatively short span of time, the consequences of this transformation extended beyond individual cases, reaching into the structure of families and diminishing the continuity through which knowledge, memory, and identity had been preserved. The loss of elders and knowledge holders during epidemic periods had implications that extended far beyond immediate mortality, as oral traditions, genealogies, and cultural practices depended on uninterrupted transmission between generations. When these connections were disrupted, the impact was not only demographic but also structural, altering the way in which communities could maintain coherence in the face of ongoing external pressures. Missionary records produced during their early presence on the island later reflected an awareness that what they were witnessing was not a temporary disruption, but a sustained demographic decline that altered the fundamental organization of the population. Figures such as Eugène Hérault and later Catholic missionaries documented the island during periods of severe population reduction, often describing settlements with diminished activity and a visible reduction in social density compared to earlier periods of contact. While these records vary in tone and interpretation, they consistently point toward a prolonged pattern of decline that could not be attributed to a single event, but rather to a combination of repeated exposure and compounding vulnerability. Across broader 19th century Pacific contexts, similar patterns of introduced disease were documented in other isolated island societies, providing a wider framework through which the conditions observed on Rapa Nui could be partially understood. In places such as Hawaii, Tahiti, and parts of Melanesia, contact with European ships had already demonstrated how rapidly epidemics could reshape populations that had no prior exposure to foreign pathogens, often resulting in dramatic demographic shifts within short periods of time. These comparative cases do not reduce the specificity of Rapa Nui's experience, but they do situate it within a wider historical pattern of biological exchange that accompanied maritime expansion across the Pacific. Yet even with comparative accounts available, the specific trajectory on Rapa Nui retained an element of uncertainty, as the interaction between isolation, limited immunity, and repeated external contact created outcomes that resisted simple explanation. The island's extreme remoteness meant that communication with external medical or administrative systems was limited, and by the time later observers attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events, much of the earliest evidence had already been lost to time, memory, or incomplete record-keeping. This absence of clarity contributed to a lingering ambiguity in how the events were interpreted, both by those who witnessed them and by those who later attempted to document them from partial accounts. As the progression of illness continued, it became increasingly difficult to separate individual cases from broader environmental conditions, since the effects were no longer confined to isolated households, but appeared across multiple parts of the island in ways that suggested systemic exposure rather than localized incidents. In such conditions, even ordinary population fluctuations could take on heightened significance, as each new loss reinforced the perception that the underlying stability of the community had been altered in ways that were not yet fully understood. The island, already shaped by earlier disruptions of contact, now found itself navigating a second layer of consequence that operated not through movement across the ocean, but through the quiet transformation of life within its own boundaries. What distinguished this phase from earlier encounters was not only the presence of disease itself, but the speed with which it revealed the fragility of existing structures once continuity was interrupted. Without stable generational transmission, the systems that sustained social and cultural knowledge began to contract, leaving fewer individuals able to carry forward practices that had once been widely distributed across the population. The result was not an immediate collapse, but a gradual narrowing of continuity, where each successive loss made the next disruption more difficult to absorb. By the time its full scope could be understood, the conditions that produced it had already settled into the island's history without a clear point of origin to return to. The missionaries who found a dying world. Upon the gradual emergence of missionary descriptions from Rapa Nui during the 19th century, the earliest written impressions conveyed not the discovery of a new world, but the observation of one already altered by earlier waves of disruption that were not immediately visible in their origins. These accounts did not arrive as sudden revelations, but as carefully constructed reports shaped by the limited conditions under which missionaries such as Eugène Hérault and later Catholic observers encountered the island, where the act of documentation itself became inseparable from interpretation. What they described was not an untouched society awaiting encounter, but a population and cultural structure already bearing the accumulated effects of prior contact, demographic decline, and external disruption, though the full sequence of causes was not yet clearly understood by those recording it. When sustained missionary presence began to take shape on the island, recorded observations emphasized conditions that appeared internally stable, yet structurally diminished, suggesting that what remained was functioning within constraints that were not fully understood by outside observers. Settlements were still present, daily activity still continued, and social interactions still occurred, yet these visible elements masked a deeper transformation that had already altered the scale and continuity of the population. Early missionaries often noted that while life was present, it appeared reduced in density and rhythm, compared to expectations formed through experiences in other parts of the Pacific, where larger populations and more continuous cultural frameworks provided clearer reference points for interpretation. Throughout these early accounts, attention repeatedly returned to the condition of cultural practices that persisted in fragmented forms, where rituals, language, and inherited knowledge appeared present, yet no longer maintained their earlier continuity. What was being observed was not the disappearance of tradition in a single moment, but its gradual compression into fewer carriers and fewer contexts, as the loss of population and interruption of generational transmission altered the way knowledge could be sustained. Missionary writings frequently recorded ceremonies or customs that seemed incomplete when compared to descriptions gathered from earlier periods, though it remained difficult for observers to determine whether this represented adaptation, erosion, or a combination of both processes unfolding simultaneously. In some instances, missionaries also documented the practical conditions under which such observations were made, noting that communication barriers, translation limitations, and the absence of shared conceptual frameworks often shaped the precision with which cultural practices could be recorded. Much of what was written depended on intermittent interaction and selective visibility, meaning that certain aspects of daily life were observed only in brief or partial form, while others remained entirely outside the scope of the written record. This unevenness in documentation introduced a layer of uncertainty into nearly every description, where even accurate observations could not always be fully contextualized within the broader structure of island life. As written documentation increased, missionaries began to describe the island not as a site of active transformation alone, but as a place where prior disruptions had already reshaped the foundations upon which daily life continued to operate. This shift in interpretation is significant because it reflects a growing awareness that what was being witnessed could not be explained solely through immediate observation, but required an understanding of earlier events that were not fully accessible through direct contact. The island in these descriptions appeared less like a society changing in the present moment, and more like a structure continuing to function after its primary conditions had already been altered. Within these interpretations, external observers frequently recorded what they perceived as institutional and social decline, though the underlying conditions reflected a more complex sequence of earlier losses that were not always distinguishable in real time. Population reduction, cultural fragmentation, and the consequences of repeated external contact had already reshaped the island's capacity to maintain continuity. Yet these factors were often interpreted through broader 19th century frameworks that tended to emphasize linear decline rather than cumulative disruption. As a result, missionary accounts sometimes described what they saw in terms that suggested simplification, even when the reality involved overlapping layers of survival and adaptation. At the same time, interactions between surviving island traditions and newly introduced religious frameworks created overlapping systems of meaning, where neither structure fully replaced the other, yet both influenced how reality was being recorded and understood. Missionaries introduced new forms of literacy, religious practice, and institutional organization, which gradually became embedded within the island's evolving social landscape, but these changes did not erase existing cultural frameworks entirely. Instead, they produced a layered environment in which older traditions continued in altered forms, often reinterpreted through new symbolic systems that shifted their original context without fully removing their presence. Across successive missionary reports, comparisons were occasionally drawn with other Pacific societies undergoing similar contact-driven changes, although Rapa Nui consistently appeared as an extreme case of cumulative disruption within a confined geographic environment. In other island contexts, population decline and cultural transformation were often documented alongside larger demographic bases or more extensive regional connections, which allowed for partial recovery or adaptation over time. On Rapa Nui, however, the combination of isolation and repeated external contact created conditions in which even small-scale disruptions had amplified effects, making the island appear to observers as an intensified version of broader regional patterns. Even with increasing documentation, the difficulty of distinguishing between adaptation and erosion remained present in nearly all written accounts, leaving interpretation dependent on limited observation rather than complete contextual understanding. Missionaries were often recording a society in transition without access to the full historical sequence that had produced its current condition, which meant that what they described was filtered through the immediate circumstances of their arrival. This limitation shaped how Rapa Nui was represented in external records, where visible reduction was sometimes interpreted as finality, even when internal processes of continuity and adjustment were still present. By the final phase of early missionary engagement, descriptions of the island increasingly reflected a tension between what could be documented and what seemed to exist beyond the reach of formal explanation. The act of writing itself became a boundary between observed reality and inferred meaning, where certain aspects of cultural life could be recorded with precision, while others remained resistant to classification or interpretation. In this space between documentation and uncertainty, the island was gradually defined not only by what was seen, but also by what could not be fully translated into the language of external record. The written record gradually contracted into descriptions that could no longer account for everything the island had already become before it was first carefully observed. The stories sailors carried back across the ocean. Naval journals compiled after departure from Rapa Nui began to show subtle shifts in description once the island was no longer within immediate sight, as the act of recording itself introduced a distance that altered how events were framed. What had been experienced in real time as fragmented observation, shaped by weather, limited visibility, and brief encounters along the coastline, gradually became more ordered in written form as officers and sailors translated memory into structured narrative. This transition did not occur as a deliberate alteration of truth, but as a natural consequence of separation, where the absence of the island itself allowed interpretation to expand into areas that had not been fully defined during direct observation. Sketches produced aboard returning vessels preserved visual impressions of the island's monumental figures, yet these images already reflected a separation from the environmental and cultural context in which they were originally observed. The moai, as they were rendered in early drawings, associated with voyages such as those initiated after the first recorded European contact in 1722 by Jacob Roggeveen, often appeared isolated against simplified landscapes, with proportion and scale adjusted to fit the limitations of memory and maritime conditions. Over time, these sketches began to circulate beyond the voyages themselves, becoming reference points for audiences who had never seen the island directly, and in that circulation, visual interpretation began to detach further from original experience. Written logs maintained by ship officers gradually emphasized formalized observation over uncertainty, filtering out the informal and fragmented impressions that had accompanied the experience of contact. In these logs, descriptions of terrain, settlement visibility, and coastal formations were recorded in measured language, often prioritizing navigational relevance and comparative geography over cultural nuance. This shift in emphasis created a version of the island that was increasingly defined by what could be consistently described, rather than what had been ambiguously encountered, shaping early external understanding through selective clarity. Port gatherings where sailors first recounted their journeys became early sites of narrative transformation, where fragmented descriptions of Rapa Nui merged with interpretations shaped by repetition and audience reaction. In these spaces, accounts were not merely repeated but reshaped through expectation, as listeners sought coherence in stories that had originally been experienced in disjointed form. The island in these retellings began to acquire attributes that extended beyond immediate observation, as gaps in memory were filled with inference, speculation, or emphasis placed on particularly striking details such as monumental stone structures and isolated geography. Variations between repeated tellings of the same voyage revealed how quickly maritime accounts could diverge from one another, producing inconsistencies that grew more pronounced with each retelling. Details that were uncertain in original logs became points of divergence in oral transmission, where different crew members emphasized different aspects of the same journey, sometimes focusing on population size, sometimes on landscape, and sometimes on the perceived scale of the island's stone architecture. These divergences did not immediately invalidate the accounts, but instead accumulated into parallel versions of the same experience, each carrying partial authority without full resolution. European scholarly discussion later incorporated these circulating reports into broader theoretical frameworks concerning isolated civilizations, positioning Rapa Nui within emerging debates about cultural development and decline during the 18th and 19th centuries as exploration expanded across the Pacific. Intellectual interpretation of remote societies increasingly relied on comparative models that attempted to classify levels of cultural complexity based on limited observational data. Within this context, Rapa Nui became associated with questions about how such monumental structures could exist in apparent isolation, prompting theories that often reflected broader intellectual trends rather than direct empirical certainty. Published travel narratives from the period often presented the island's architecture as evidence open to competing interpretations, oscillating between recognition of complexity and assumptions of historical deterioration. Writers described the moai and associated platforms with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty, noting their scale while struggling to reconcile their presence with the smaller populations later observed during subsequent visits. This tension between physical evidence and perceived societal condition became a recurring feature of published accounts, shaping how the island was situated within wider narratives of Pacific exploration. Additional voyages that followed did not resolve earlier inconsistencies but instead introduced further variations, making it increasingly difficult to separate first-hand observation from accumulated narrative reinterpretation. Each new expedition contributed additional descriptions that sometimes confirmed earlier reports and sometimes contradicted them, reinforcing the sense that the island existed within a shifting field of perception rather than a stable descriptive framework. Over time, the accumulation of these layered accounts created a composite image that reflected multiple moments of contact rather than a single coherent observation. By the time geographic and cultural records of Rapa Nui had stabilized in academic discourse, the island's identity had already been assembled from multiple layers of reporting that no longer aligned with a single observational origin. What had begun as direct maritime observation gradually transformed into a structured body of knowledge shaped by repeated interpretation, translation, and scholarly categorization, where each stage of transmission introduced subtle shifts in emphasis and meaning. In this stabilized form, the island existed less as a direct record of experience and more as a constructed synthesis of overlapping historical perspectives. No single version of the island's reality remained intact once its descriptions had passed far enough from the place where they were first recorded. The fear that the island was already dead. Reconciliation of the earlier surviving descriptions of Rapa Nui exposed contradictions that resisted alignment even under close comparison, as each recorded account appeared to subtly redefine the conditions it was originally intended to preserve. What began as a body of navigational and observational writing produced during the earliest periods of sustained contact gradually became, in later analysis, a fragmented archive where meaning shifted depending on which version of the record was being examined. In this process, the island was no longer encountered as a single continuous subject of observation, but as a collection of overlapping interpretations that never fully converged into one stable account. In broader studies of Pacific contact histories, Rapa Nui began to occupy an uncertain position where expected sequences of societal change did not align cleanly with the available historical record. Other island societies affected by European maritime expansion often followed patterns that could be more clearly traced through demographic and cultural transitions. Yet, Rapa Nui repeatedly resisted simple placement within these comparative frameworks. The difficulty did not lie in a lack of documentation, but in the way each layer of documentation seemed to introduce new uncertainties when placed alongside earlier or later interpretations of the same events. Earlier observational reports, once treated as stable references, gradually lost coherence as demographic notes, cultural descriptions, and environmental impressions failed to converge into a consistent narrative trajectory. Population estimates recorded during different periods of contact did not always align, and descriptions of settlement density and social organization varied depending on the conditions under which they were recorded and the interpretive assumptions of the observers themselves. Over time, these inconsistencies accumulated into a pattern that suggested not a single continuous transformation, but multiple partial reconstructions of a reality that could no longer be fully recovered in its original form. Comparative analysis of isolated island societies introduced by external contact repeatedly returned to Rapa Nui as a case where physical structures persisted without an equally traceable continuity of social conditions. The monumental stone figures and ceremonial platforms documented by early explorers remained materially present, yet the social systems required to sustain and contextualize them appeared only partially visible within the surviving records. This imbalance between material endurance and recorded continuity became a recurring point of tension in later interpretations, particularly when attempting to understand how such structures related to the population levels described in different historical accounts. Some interpretive frameworks eventually shifted away from linear decline models, instead suggesting that the temporal origin of observed conditions could no longer be confidently determined from surviving evidence. Rather than tracing a clear sequence from flourishing society to diminished population, these approaches acknowledged that the available record might only represent intermittent points within a much longer and partially obscured timeline. In this view, the difficulty was not simply reconstructing what had changed, but establishing when those changes had first become visible enough to be recorded at all. Tension within scholarly debate intensified around the relationship between monumental construction and recorded population levels, particularly where material presence appeared inconsistent with documented demographic scale. The question of how such large-scale stone structures could be created and maintained by a relatively small population, as described in later contact-era observations, became central to broader discussions about labour organisation, social coordination, and historical continuity on the island. Yet each proposed explanation remained dependent on incomplete data, leaving room for multiple interpretations that could not be fully reconciled. Re-examinations of voyage logs and missionary observations progressively replaced direct narrative certainty with inference, as missing contextual details began to shape the structure of historical explanation itself. What had originally been written as an observational description increasingly functioned as a foundation for later reconstruction, where information gaps were filled through comparative reasoning rather than direct evidence. In this way, the absence of complete records became an active component in how the island's past was understood, influencing not only what was concluded, but also how conclusions were formed. Archaeological and ethnographic research continued to refine aspects of Rapa Nui's past, yet unresolved chronological gaps sustained multiple interpretations that resisted full convergence. Excavations and material analysis contributed important insights into settlement patterns and cultural development, but they did not fully resolve the underlying question of how different historical accounts related to one another in time. As a result, each new layer of evidence tended to clarify certain aspects of the island's history, while simultaneously leaving other aspects open to continued interpretation. Historical reconstruction of the island eventually stabilized into layered interpretive models that no longer depended on a single coherent sequence of events. Instead, Rapa Nui's past came to be understood through overlapping frameworks that emphasized different aspects of the same material and documentary evidence, each highlighting certain continuities while downplaying others. In this stabilized form, historical understanding became less about establishing a definitive narrative and more about managing the coexistence of multiple partial narratives that could not be fully merged. Easter Island, as it emerges through the combined weight of ship logs, missionary records and later interpretation, remains ultimately unreachable as a single historical reality, existing instead as a place continually rebuilt through fragments that never fully return to their origin.